He arrived on a Tuesday in September expecting to find a town that needed a doctor. This was a reasonable expectation. The county board had been advertising the posting for 2 years with no takers. The territory's population had been growing faster than its medical infrastructure, and the letter they had sent him specifically used the phrase urgent medical need 3 times in 4 paragraphs. He had accepted the posting and ridden 3 days from Denver with his medical bag and his case of pharmaceutical supplies, and the particular confidence of a man who has just finished 3 years of practice at Pennsylvania Hospital and is ready for something that will require everything he has. He found the town without difficulty. He found the boarding house without difficulty. He found Vera Lund without difficulty because she was coming out of the Harkins house with her medical bag when he turned the corner on his second morning, and the woman at the door was thanking her with the specific gratitude of someone whose crisis has been managed by someone they trust. And Vera said something that made the woman relax and close the door. And then she turned and saw Thomas standing in the road with his own bag, and she looked at him for a moment and said, "You're the new doctor?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm Vera Lund, come have coffee and I'll tell you what the town needs." He followed her without fully understanding yet what he was walking into. Thomas Hartley had graduated from Jefferson Medical College in 1878, the 3rd generation of his family to do so, which was a fact his father mentioned with specific frequency. He had entered medicine because his aptitude for it was evident from early in his schooling, and because the Hartley family had produced physicians in the same way other families produced lawyers or merchants. It was simply the expected shape of a certain kind of life. He did not resent this. He had found the work genuinely absorbing, and he was good at it. And being good at things had always been sufficient reason for Thomas Hartley to continue doing them. He had completed 3 years at Pennsylvania Hospital after his degree, where he had been regarded as thorough, precise, and occasionally difficult to work with in the specific way of someone who expects the same level of precision from others that he maintains himself, and finds the gap between expectation and reality professionally frustrating. He had not been unkind. He had been exacting. He had come west partly because the frontier posting was the only one that offered what he had started looking for in his 3rd year at the hospital, which was a different kind of work. Not the refinement of known methods in a well-supplied institution, but something rawer, something where the work itself was the primary challenge rather than the navigation of the institution around the work. He had also come partly because his father had expected him to stay in Philadelphia and take a position at Jefferson's teaching hospital, and the expectation had been expressed so thoroughly and with such certainty that Thomas had found himself, for the first time in his professional life, deliberately choosing otherwise. This was not a sophisticated piece of self-knowledge. He was aware of it only in the way that a person becomes aware of something they have been doing unconsciously, when they see the outcome and recognize the pattern. He had not expected to find the job already being done. He had not expected to find it done well. Vera Lund had been the closest thing Millstone Creek had to a doctor since 1875, which was 7 years, which was the year she was 31 and had stopped pretending that what she was doing was just neighborly assistance and started doing it as the work it was. She had begun learning at 19 under a circuit doctor named Fletcher, who had come through the territory in the late 1860s. She had been the one available when there was an injury or a fever, which is how it happened in frontier towns. Whoever was most capable and present became the person, and she had been most capable and present. Fletcher had spent 4 days teaching her everything he had time to teach her, and left her his copies of Gray's Anatomy and Flint's Practice of Medicine, and 2 other volumes, and she had read all of them over the following 2 years while continuing to practice, because the reading and the practicing were, she had found, completely different kinds of learning, and she required both. 7 years of sole practice in a frontier county of 1,200 people, ranchers, miners, homesteaders, and the particular population of people who ended up in frontier counties because they had nowhere else to be, had given her an education that no medical school had a course for. She had delivered 112 babies, kept in a ledger she had started because Fletcher had told her to keep records, and which she had continued because the records turned out to be how she learned, the outcomes of one case informing the approach to the next. She had managed fevers of all the varieties the territory produced, and fractures from falls and cattle work, and the occasional disagreement between men who'd been too long on the trail, and infections and digestive crises and the specific respiratory problems that the mining community produced in men who had been breathing rock dust for years without anyone telling them it mattered. She had also managed situations that her books had no chapters for, the things people came to her with after dark, the cases that required discretion more than medicine, the grief that dressed itself as physical complaint and required her to treat both the body and the thing underneath it. She charged what people could pay. Sometimes that was money, sometimes it was goods, sometimes it was nothing, and she made the nothing work by managing her own expenses with the precision she managed everything else. She had made a kind of living and built a kind of standing, and had not built any official recognition, because the official recognition required credentials she had not been permitted to earn. The Female Medical College of Pennsylvania had been accepting women since 1850, but it was in Philadelphia, and she had been in the Colorado Territory since 1869, and the two facts had never managed to coincide. Jefferson Medical College, where Thomas had trained, did not admit women in 1875, and did not admit them in 1882, and she did not expect them to have changed their minds by the time the letter arrived from the county board saying the official doctor was on his way. She was not going to stop practicing, because a man had arrived with a piece of paper she had not been allowed to earn. She was simply not going to do that. Thomas spent his first week trying to see patients, which proved more complicated than he had anticipated. Several of them said they would wait for Mrs. Lund. He had not been warned that there would be a Mrs. Lund to wait for. The county board's letter had mentioned limited prior medical resources in a way that suggested an absence rather than a presence, and he was learning that the distance between limited resources and no resources could be considerable. He made notes. He introduced himself. He unpacked his pharmaceutical supplies in the room the county had arranged for his practice, which was the back room of the courthouse, and he organized them the way he had been trained to organize them, and he waited for patients who mostly did not come because they had somewhere else to go. One of the patients who didn't come to him came to him anyway, which was Ed Harkins, the rancher, who had Vera already on her way when Thomas arrived at the Harkins house on the Thursday of his first week. He stood in the doorway and watched her work for 20 minutes before she noticed him. She was managing a broken rib assessment with the complete competence of someone who has done it many times and knows exactly which questions to ask in which order and what to do with each answer. She was also doing something his training had not specifically taught him, talking to Ed Harkins about his cattle operation while she worked, in the easy, familiar tone of someone who knows the patient's life and has decided that the knowledge is clinically relevant, which it was. The talking kept Harkins from guarding, and the absence of guarding made the examination more accurate, and more accurate examination produced better information, and better information produced better treatment. Thomas drove home and read his textbooks that evening, and did not find a chapter on this. In the second week, he went to her door with the formal intention of discussing the county's position on unlicensed medical practice, which was his professional obligation, and which he had been composing in his head since Tuesday. She opened the door, looked at his face, and said, "Come in and have coffee, and say what you actually came to say." He sat at her table. She made the coffee. He looked at the shelves, the books, the pharmaceutical supplies she had obtained herself through what networks he could not yet guess, the ledger on the shelf with 112 deliveries recorded in her neat, regular columns. He began his prepared remarks about the county's position. He stopped in the middle of the third sentence. He said, "I don't know what to do about you." She said, "Neither do I." He said, "That's honest." She said, "It's the most useful thing I know how to be." She brought the coffee and sat across from him. "I've been doing this for 7 years," she said. "I'm going to keep doing it. What I want to know is whether we're going to fight about it, which neither of us will enjoy, or whether we're going to find another way," he said. "I'm not certain I have the authority to fight about it, if I'm honest with myself," she said. "You have the county contract," he said. "You have the town's trust," she said. "Those aren't the same kind of authority," he said. "No, but they're both real," she said. "Yes." She poured more coffee. He stayed another hour and a half, which was not what he had planned and which told him something about what he was going to do. The fever case came in the third week. A child named Lily Marsh, 7 years old, the daughter of the homesteader on the North Road, who had been running a fever for 4 days before either of them was called. Vera had been managing the case since day 1. Thomas was called in on day 5 by Lily's father, who had heard the county had an official doctor now and wanted him involved. Thomas examined the child and arrived at a clinical position that differed from Vera's. His training said one thing. Her 7 years said something different. The specific mechanism of the fever and the best approach to bringing it down. They were looking at the same child and seeing different treatments, both based on real knowledge, and neither of them knew with certainty whose knowledge was right. Lily's mother was standing in the doorway between the bedroom and the hall, looking at both of them, which is how it always is when two people with authority disagree about something that belongs to a third person who has not asked for the disagreement. Thomas made the call. He was the county doctor. He had the degree and the license and the county contract and the authority those things conferred, and he used it. He said what he had decided and what he was going to do, and he said it clearly, in the same precise voice he used for everything. Vera looked at him for a moment. She picked up her bag and left the room without argument and without a scene, which was its own kind of statement. Not anger, just a woman who has spent 7 years being the authority in situations like this one, and who has decided that this particular night is not the night to make it a conflict. Thomas applied his treatment. He sat with Lily Marsh for 2 hours. He went home at midnight. The child was not improved. At 2 in the morning, Vera came back. Thomas did not know this until the following day, when Mrs. Marsh told him, in the careful way of a woman reporting something she's not sure the relevant people are going to be comfortable hearing. Vera had come back at 2 and done what she had been going to do, with the particular certainty of someone who has sat with 7 years of similar cases and knows the difference between a fever that will resolve with patience and one that needs specific intervention. Lily Marsh's fever broke at 4 in the morning. She was sitting up and asking for breakfast by 7. He sat with this for a day before he went to her. He was not certain his treatment had been wrong. Children's fevers were unpredictable and the improvement might have come regardless of what was done. And his training required him to be honest about what he knew versus what he assumed, and the honest position was that he had insufficient data. He sat with the outcome for 2 days before he went to her. The honest clinical position was that he had insufficient data. Children's fevers were unpredictable and Lily Marsh would very likely have improved regardless of any intervention, and his training required him to hold that uncertainty honestly, which he did, and also required him to acknowledge that the uncertainty was itself uncomfortable, and the discomfort was its own information worth examining. He went to her house on the morning of the 3rd day, not to apologize. Premature apology was its own imprecision, but to ask what she had done and why. She opened the door, she looked at him, she stepped back from the door and let him in, and he understood that was a decision she had made. She told him everything. She cited 3 texts he recognized from medical school and 2 he had not seen. One written by a woman physician in Boston in 1874 that Jefferson had not assigned. She cited 7 years of outcome data on fever in this specific population at this elevation. Data his textbooks could not have covered because it was specific to here. He listened without interrupting, which cost him something. He asked how much of what he was doing in the county was new to her. She said, "Almost none of the medicine, some of the supply access." He said, "What do I have that you don't?" She said, "A degree, a license, the county contract, the Denver pharmaceutical account." He said, "Those aren't nothing." She said, "No, and what do I have that you don't?" He looked at his hands, his thinking gesture she would later learn. He said, 7 years, and their trust." She said, "Yes." He wrote to the county board that week. He proposed a formal arrangement. Vera Lund as his licensed assistant under the county contract, which gave her official standing and pharmaceutical access, and a quarterly payment that was not adequate but was something. He spent 2 days composing the letter. He sent it. The county board took 3 weeks to reply and then said yes, partly because it was cheaper than hiring a second doctor, and partly because they had heard from enough people in the county about Vera Lund that they understood the situation better than Thomas had given them credit for. She accepted the arrangement, which she told him she was accepting not because she needed his permission to practice medicine, but because she had been doing this work for 7 years without pharmaceutical access or official standing, and she was 38 years old and tired of both of those things, and if a piece of paper would fix them, then a piece of paper was worth having. He said, "I know it's not adequate." She said, "No, but it's what we have," he said. "I'm going to write to Jefferson Medical College." She looked at him. He said, "About correspondence programs for women in the territories who have demonstrated clinical competence." She said, "They'll say no." He said, "Probably, but they'll have to say it to my face, which is different from just not allowing it to happen." She said nothing for a moment. She said, "You haven't known me for very long," he said. "I've known you long enough." She said, "To know what?" He said, "That the proposition is worth making." They worked alongside each other through the fall and into the winter, which was its own education for both of them. Thomas discovered that his pharmaceutical knowledge and his diagnostic training were real assets that Vera's 7 years had not given her, not because she lacked the intelligence to use them, but because she had lacked access to the supply lines and the equipment they required. She discovered that Thomas's training had given him a systematic approach to differential diagnosis that her practice-based learning had partially replicated and partially missed, and that the partially missed portions were the kind of thing she could learn from him in ways that she had not been able to learn from books alone. They disagreed with some regularity, which was not a problem because they had both established early in the arrangement that disagreement was information rather than conflict, and that the correct response to disagreement was to examine the reasoning rather than to defer to whoever had the official standing. This was not the usual way of things. Thomas had come from a hospital context, where hierarchy was how disagreement was resolved, and Vera had come from 7 years of being the only one whose opinion was consulted, and they met somewhere in the middle of those two experiences and built something that worked better than either would have on their own. They tracked the outcomes in Vera's ledger, which became their joint ledger, which was the most intimate thing that had happened between them, and which neither of them pointed out for a long time, because pointing it out would have required them to acknowledge what kind of thing it was. He asked her one evening in December, while they were going over the week's cases at her kitchen table with the lamp between them and the wind outside doing what December wind does, what she would have done if she had been born in Philadelphia with a father who could have sent her to Jefferson Medical College. She looked at the ledger for a moment. She said, "Exactly what I've been doing, with the degree," he said. "I think you would have been better than me," she said. "I don't think it's a competition," he said. "No," a pause. "But if it were?" She looked at him over the lamp. She said, "I've had 7 years more practice," he said. "That's a fair point," she said. "It is." A pause. She said, "You've been here 3 months and you've already changed 3 things about how I practice," he said. "You've changed more than 3 things about how I practice," she said. "That's because more than 3 things needed changing," he said. "That's also a fair point." She looked at the ledger. He looked at it too. It was full of their cases, his handwriting and hers, his notation system and hers, gradually blending into something that was both and neither. She said, "You're going to send that letter?" He said, "Yes," she said. "They'll say no," he said. "Probably," she said. "More than once," he said. "Yes," she said. "You'll send it again," he said. "Yes," she said. "Why?" he said. "Because you were doing my job before I arrived and doing it better, and the fact that you don't have the credential is a problem with the credential, not with you." She was quiet for a long time. She said, "That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 7 years, he said. "Then it needed saying 7 years ago." She went back to the ledger. He went back to his notes. Neither of them said anything else that needed saying that evening, because the ledger had everything they had built together, and that was enough, and they both knew it. He sent the letter to Jefferson Medical College in March, which was 6 months after he had arrived in Millstone Creek expecting to find a town that needed a doctor. They replied in June saying the proposition was unprecedented, and asking whether he had considered the difficulties inherent in establishing competency standards for informal practitioners. He wrote back in July saying he had considered them thoroughly, which was why he was proposing a formal assessment process rather than a simple credential waiver, and that he had a specific practitioner in mind whose outcomes over 7 years of practice he was prepared to document in detail if they wished to examine the evidence, Jefferson replied again in September asking for that documentation. He wrote that letter at Vera's kitchen table on a Saturday morning while she was seeing a patient in the next room. When she came out, he read it to her. She made 3 corrections and handed it back. He made the corrections and sent the letter, and that was how they wrote the case for her credential together without either of them using the word together, which was exactly the right way to do it and which they both understood was the right way, and understanding the same thing without saying it had become, by September, simply how they worked.